Beneath the ruins of Berlin lies a dark chapter of history, a concrete tomb where the Third Reich breathed its last. Hitler's bunker, a labyrinth of reinforced concrete and desperation, held secrets that would remain hidden for decades.
Because of the small dimensions of the bunker, due to the thick reinforced concrete walls, the briefing room was tiny, just 3.5 by 3.5 meters.
As Soviet forces closed in on the Nazi capital in April 1945, Hitler retreated underground to a fortified shelter that would become both his final command center and his grave. Yet the full story of what transpired in those cramped corridors remained elusive for years. When historians finally gained access to sealed rooms within the complex, what they discovered painted a chilling portrait of the final days of history's most notorious dictator and his inner circle as their 1,000-year Reich crumbled around them. As the Allied forces closed in on Berlin from all sides, Hitler needed a sanctuary, a place to direct his failing war effort while sheltered from the increasing Allied bombing raids. The answer was the Führer bunker, not merely a simple bomb shelter, but a sophisticated underground complex designed to serve as the nerve center of the crumbling Nazi regime.
Hitler wanted to be sure that he could stay in Berlin and control events from there. I think he was always afraid of being away from Berlin.
Construction of the Führer bunker began in 1943, built directly beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. Engineers designed it to withstand the most ferocious bombing campaigns, with reinforced concrete walls up to 13 feet thick and a concrete ceiling nearly 5 meters deep. The complex consisted of two distinct sections, the Vorbunker forward bunker, completed in 1936, and the Führer bunker itself, a deeper addition completed in 1944 specifically for Hitler and his closest associates. The bunker lay approximately 8.5 meters beneath the surface, deep enough to muffle the constant thunder of artillery and air raids that pounded Berlin in those final months. Entering through the Reich Chancellery gardens, visitors would descend a set of concrete stairs into a claustrophobic world of narrow corridors, low ceilings, and the perpetual hum of ventilation systems straining to circulate fresh air. Despite its military purpose, the Führer bunker contained approximately 30 small rooms arranged on 2 levels. The upper level housed guards, servants, and various staff members, while the lower level was reserved for Hitler and his inner circle. These rooms included Hitler's personal study, a conference room, communication center, and modest living quarters. Though built for function rather than comfort, certain areas were furnished to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Hitler's personal quarters featured simple furniture, a few paintings, and even a small photograph of his mother. The bunker's life support systems were remarkably advanced for the time. Power came from diesel generators that provided electricity for lighting, communication equipment, and the critical ventilation systems. Water was supplied by deep wells, making the bunker self-sufficient even as Berlin's infrastructure collapsed around it. Telephone lines connected the bunker to military command centers throughout what remained of the Reich, allowing Hitler to issue orders even as his actual control over events rapidly diminished. The fall of Berlin and Hitler's last days. By early April 1945, the collapse of the Third Reich was inevitable. Soviet forces had pushed through Eastern Europe and were advancing on Berlin from the east, while American and British forces closed in from the west. The once mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to a desperate collection of regular army units, Volkssturm, People's Militia, comprised of old men and boys, and fanatical SS troops determined to fight to the death. The battle for Berlin began in earnest on April 16th when Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front launched a massive offensive against the city's eastern defenses. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by 6,150 tanks and 7,500 aircraft, converged on the German capital. Against this overwhelming force, the Germans could muster only about 45,000 soldiers and irregulars, many of whom were poorly trained and equipped. As the Soviets tightened their noose around Berlin, Hitler descended permanently into the Führer bunker on January 16, 1945, never to emerge again. The underground complex quickly became the scene of a bizarre disconnect from reality. In rooms lined with military maps showing the hopeless position of non-existent German divisions, Hitler continued to issue orders to phantom armies, planning counter-offensives with forces that had long since been destroyed. Daily life in the bunker took on a surreal quality. Despite the deteriorating military situation, some elements of routine persisted. Hitler would wake around noon, receive military briefings that grew increasingly dire, and hold meetings with his remaining loyal officers. Meals were served at regular times in a small dining area where Hitler, now physically diminished with a noticeable tremor in his left hand, would frequently launch into long monologues about betrayal, missed opportunities, and his vision for Germany. The atmosphere within the bunker alternated between manic optimism and deep despair. Hitler would swing between rage-filled tirades upon learning of yet another military failure and brief moments of delusional hope when hearing about a minor tactical success. By April 27th, even Hitler could no longer deny the inevitable. That day, during a situation briefing, he suffered a complete breakdown upon learning that an ordered counterattack by SS General Steiner's forces could not be executed because those forces no longer existed. In what witnesses described as a devastating realization, Hitler finally admitted that the war was lost. In a chilling calm that followed his outburst, he declared his intention to remain in Berlin and die there. He dismissed most of his staff and inner circle, allowing them to flee the doomed city. Those who remained included his newlywed wife, Eva Braun, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his family, and a few devoted aides like Martin Bormann. The suicide room where Hitler died. The concrete chamber where history's most notorious dictator ended his life was surprisingly modest, a small space approximately 3 meters by 4 meters with plain walls and simple furnishings. Located on the lower level of the Führer bunker, Hitler's personal suite consisted of a study connected to a bedroom and a bathroom. It was in the sitting room area of this suite that Hitler and his new bride of less than 40 hours, Eva Braun, would end their lives on April 30th, 1945. According to testimony from those present in the bunker, the events of that final day followed a macabre routine. Hitler arose late on April 30th after a restless night, during which the sounds of Soviet artillery had grown ever closer. He met with his remaining staff, had a light lunch, and then summoned his secretary Traudl Jung to dictate his personal and political testaments. Documents that mixed personal farewells with unrepentant anti-Semitism and a final defense of his actions. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun said their goodbyes to the small group still remaining in the bunker. Witnesses described a strangely formal scene, handshakes for the men, with Eva Braun embracing some of the women. The couple then retired to Hitler's private suite and closed the door. What happened next is known primarily through the accounts of Hitler's valet, Heinz Linger, and SS adjutant Otto Günscher, who would later enter the room. The suicide room, when later examined by Soviet investigators, revealed the grim tableau. On a small sofa upholstered in blue fabric sat the bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. Hitler had shot himself in the right temple with his Walter PPK 7.5mm pistol, which was found at his feet. Eva Braun, who had chosen to die by cyanide poisoning, was slumped at the other end of the sofa. She had not used the pistol Hitler had offered her, preferring instead to bite a cyanide capsule. Physical evidence recovered from the room included the pistol, scattered documents on a small adjacent table, and 2 empty cyanide vials. Hitler was dressed in his customary uniform, black trousers, grey jacket, and white shirt, though accounts mention that he had removed his medals and insignia before his death. Eva Braun wore a blue dress with black trimming, one of her favorites that Hitler had always admired. Following prearranged orders, Hitler's body was wrapped in a grey blanket and carried up the stairs of the bunker to the Reich Chancellery garden. There, in a shallow depression created by an artillery shell, Hitler and Eva Braun's remains were doused with gasoline and set ablaze. Soviet forensic investigators would later recover charred remains from this site, including a jawbone that dental records confirmed belonged to Hitler. The forgotten rooms, hidden sections revealed. When Soviet forces first entered the Führer bunker on May 6, 1945, they encountered a labyrinthine complex that held more secrets than the architectural plans had indicated. Beyond the known areas, Hitler's quarters, the conference room, and staff accommodations, lay sections that had been sealed off or repurposed during the bunker's final days. These forgotten rooms, documented by Soviet investigators but largely overlooked in early historical accounts, provided extraordinary insights into the final chapter of the Third Reich. One of the most significant discoveries came in what historians now call the Sealed Archives Room. Located adjacent to Martin Bormann's quarters on the lower level, this space had been hastily converted into a document storage area in the war's final weeks. Soviet forces broke through a recently constructed brick wall to find file cabinets and steel boxes containing a remarkable collection of papers. Among these were private correspondence between Hitler and Eva Braun dating back to the 1930s, early drafts of Hitler's political testament showing his evolving thoughts on assigning blame for Germany's defeat, and, most significantly, communications between Hitler and Japanese Emperor Hirohito that shed new light on their strategic alliance. Another revelation came from a small unmarked room near the communications center. Initially believed to be a simple storage closet, Soviet investigators discovered it had been hastily converted into an improvised medical facility. Inside were vials of various medications, including the methamphetamine compounds Hitler had been prescribed for years. Medical equipment, including syringes and intravenous apparatus, suggested that in his final days Hitler had received intensive medical treatment beyond what his personal physician Dr. Morell had publicly acknowledged. Logs found in this room documented Hitler's deteriorating physical condition, including previously unknown seizures he had experienced in the final week of his life. Perhaps most disturbing was a concealed room accessible only through a hidden door in the lower corridor. This chamber, approximately 3 meters square, contained what appeared to be occult paraphernalia, books on Germanic mythology, astrological charts specific to Hitler's birth date, and ritual objects that suggested some in Hitler's inner circle had turned to mystical practices as rational hope faded. While historians debate the significance of these findings, the items align with known interests among certain SS leaders in Germanic paganism and occult traditions. The bunker also contained sections that had been abandoned earlier in the complex's use. Soviet forces discovered one entire corridor on the lower level that had been sealed off due to water damage. Breaking through the barriers, they found rooms in various states of decay, some containing personal belongings of Hitler's earlier staff who had departed months before. These items, including diaries, letters to family members, and personal effects, have provided historians with insights into the day-to-day reality of life in the bunker before the final crisis. Personal belongings, a window into Hitler's mind. The personal belongings recovered from Hitler's private quarters in the Führer bunker offer a fascinating and disturbing portal into the dictator's psychological state during his final days. Soviet investigators meticulously catalogued these items, creating a physical inventory that reveals the stark contrast between Hitler's public persona and his private reality as his world collapsed around him. Hitler's desk, a simple military-style workspace, contained a chaotic array of papers showing his increasingly disconnected thinking. Maps marked with non-existent army positions lay alongside doodles and sketches Hitler had made during military briefings, architectural drawings of grand buildings he still imagined would someday be built in a victorious Germany. His personal date book, recovered from a drawer, showed appointments scheduled well into May 1945, suggesting either denial or a deliberate facade of normalcy maintained even as Soviet artillery shook the bunker's foundations. The medication collection found in Hitler's quarters was particularly revealing. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had fled Berlin in the final days, but left behind an extensive pharmacopoeia that documented Hitler's deteriorating health. The Soviet inventory listed 82 different medications, including amphetamine preparations, barbiturates, hormones, and various experimental compounds. Analysis of these medications confirmed what many historians had suspected. Hitler was being maintained on a complex regimen of stimulants and sedatives that likely affected his cognitive function and decision-making abilities during crucial military situations. Perhaps most telling were Hitler's personal effects. His nightstand contained a dog-eared photograph of his mother worn around the edges from frequent handling. Next to it lay a small silver frame with a picture of his German shepherd Blondie, who had been poisoned on Hitler's orders just days before his suicide to test the efficacy of the cyanide capsules. These intimate items stood in stark contrast to the absence of photographs of mass Nazi rallies or military victories that had once defined his public image. Hitler's wardrobe revealed the physical decline of the man who once presented himself as Germany's invincible leader. His uniforms, hanging neatly in a small closet, had been modified with additional room in the waistband, accommodating his increasing weight despite food shortages throughout Germany. Several pairs of specially designed glasses were found, their increasing strength indicating his deteriorating eyesight, a condition he had hidden from the German public. Among the most psychologically revealing items were Hitler's reading materials. His bedside table contained not military strategies or political works, but rather dog-eared Western novels by Karl May, a German author whose romanticized tales of the American frontier had been Hitler's favorite reading since childhood. These escapist novels, with their simplified morality and heroic narratives, seemed to provide Hitler with psychological refuge as his actual world disintegrated. Soviet investigators also discovered a locked metal box beneath Hitler's bed containing items of a more personal nature. Inside were love letters from Eva Braun dating back to the 1930s, a lock of her hair tied with ribbon, and several pieces of jewelry he had given her over the years. The contrast between these sentimental keepsakes and the genocidal orders issued from the same room creates a disturbing psychological portrait of compartmentalization. Hitler's ability to separate his personal sentimentality from the monstrous policies he enacted. Eva Braun's quarters, the woman behind Hitler. For years, Eva Braun remained virtually unknown to the German public, Hitler's carefully hidden companion whose existence was kept secret for political reasons. Yet in the Führerbunker, she maintained private quarters that, when later examined by Soviet investigators, revealed surprising dimensions of her character and her relationship with Hitler during the Reich's final days. Eva's living space in the bunker consisted of a modest bedroom connected to a small sitting room, decorated in a style markedly different from the austere military functionality of the rest of the complex. Despite the grim circumstances, she had attempted to create a comfortable retreat with floral-patterned furniture, photographs, and personal mementos adorning the walls. Soviet investigators noted the contrast between her quarters and the rest of the bunker. Curtains had been hung over the concrete walls and a small carpet-covered part of the floor, creating an illusion of normalcy amid catastrophe. Among the most revealing items discovered were Eva's diaries, which she had maintained sporadically since 1935. The final entries, written just days before her suicide, displayed a strange dichotomy. On one page, she wrote detailed instructions for her sister about the distribution of her jewelry and clothing, while on the next, she described plans for redecorating the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, after the war. This cognitive dissonance, planning for both death and a future that could not exist, characterized many of her final writings. Eva's personal effects told the story of a woman who maintained her focus on appearance even as Berlin crumbled. Her wardrobe trunk contained 18 dresses, carefully packed despite the chaotic evacuation to the bunker. Her vanity table displayed an array of cosmetics, including French perfumes that must have been difficult to obtain in war-torn Germany. A half-used bottle of hair dye confirmed contemporaries' accounts that Eva had continued to color her hair blonde according to Hitler's preference even in the bunker's final days. Perhaps most revealing were Eva's photographs and camera equipment. An accomplished amateur photographer, she had documented much of Hitler's private life over the years. Her Leica camera was found alongside undeveloped rolls of film showing scenes from the bunker that have never been publicly released. The personal photo album recovered from her bedside contained not only formal portraits of Hitler, but candid shots of him relaxing at the Berghof, images showing a different side of the dictator than the rigid public persona he cultivated. Correspondence found in Eva's desk revealed the complex nature of her relationship with Hitler. Letters between them showed a surprising level of devotion despite Hitler's emotional detachment, noted by many historians. One poignant item discovered was a simple gold wedding band found in a small velvet box, prepared for the brief marriage ceremony that would take place just 40 hours before their joint suicide. Alongside this symbol of commitment was a small glass vial containing cyanide, presented to her by Hitler as both a wedding gift and a means of escape from Soviet capture. What surprised many investigators was evidence of Ava's awareness of political and military realities, contradicting the long-held view of her as politically naive. Books on her shelves included military histories and political analyses, some with margin notes in her handwriting. A shortwave radio in her room was tuned to BBC frequencies, suggesting she sought news beyond the propaganda presented in official German broadcasts. The map room planning the final defense. The heartbeat of military operations within the Führer bunker was the map room, a rectangular chamber approximately 5 meters by 7 meters where Hitler conducted his final military briefings and issued orders to armies that increasingly existed only on paper. When Soviet forces documented this room, they found a space frozen in time, preserving the final strategic discussions of the Third Reich's High Command. Dominating the room was a large oak table covered with military maps of Berlin and the surrounding regions. These maps, marked with colored pencils and tiny metal flags, told the story of delusional thinking that characterized Hitler's final military decisions. Soviet investigators noted with grim irony that the positions marked for German units bore little resemblance to reality. Entire army groups were indicated in positions they had abandoned weeks earlier, or in some cases in places where the units had been completely destroyed. The walls of the map room were lined with larger strategic maps showing the overall European theater. Particularly revealing were the markings tracking Soviet advances toward Berlin, which had been meticulously updated until April 27th, after which no further updates were made, suggesting the point at which Hitler finally abandoned hope of military salvation. Pencil marks on these maps showed where Hitler had drawn imaginary counterattacks using forces that no longer existed, plans that bewildered his generals but that none dared to openly contradict. Among the most significant discoveries in the map room were the stenographic records of Hitler's final military conferences. These papers, rescued from a metal container where they had been hastily stored rather than destroyed, contained verbatim accounts of Hitler's increasingly disconnected strategic directives. In one particularly revealing document dated April 22nd, Hitler can be seen shifting from lucid military assessment to rage-filled tirades against betrayal within minutes, demonstrating his psychological deterioration. Military communication equipment found in the room included several specialized field telephones connected to different sectors of Berlin's defense. Logbooks beside these phones recorded increasingly desperate messages from commanders in the field, many begging for reinforcements that didn't exist or permission to retreat that was never granted. One telephone directly connected to General Weidling's command post defending central Berlin still had its receiver off the hook, a silent testament to the breakdown in communications during the final hours. Personal items found in the map room revealed the human dimension of these apocalyptic military conferences. Half-empty coffee cups sat alongside ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. Hitler himself didn't smoke but had apparently abandoned his usual prohibition on smoking in his presence during these final days. Notepads contained doodles and calculations made by generals during Hitler's long monologues, some showing mathematical calculations of how long various units could hold out with remaining ammunition and supplies. Perhaps most revealing was a small side table where several bottles of alcohol were found, unusual given Hitler's well-known temperance. Witness testimonies later confirmed that in the final days, Hitler had allowed his military staff to drink during briefings, a significant departure from his previous strict protocols. This small detail, more than elaborate military analyses, perhaps best illustrated how thoroughly military discipline had collapsed within the Führer bunker. The Goebbels family tragedy, evidence uncovered. Among the most disturbing discoveries in the Führer bunker complex was the evidence relating to the fate of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's loyal propaganda minister, his wife Magda, and their 6 children. Unlike Hitler, who planned his suicide in private with only Eva Braun, the Goebbels family tragedy left behind extensive physical evidence that Soviet investigators documented in meticulous, horrifying detail. The Goebbels family occupied a set of connected rooms in the upper level of the bunker complex. When Soviet forces entered these quarters on May 2nd, they found them in a state that suggested the family's final day had begun with an attempt at normalcy. The children's room contained toys arranged in play patterns. A board game was set up on a small table, and dolls were positioned as if in the middle of an imaginary tea party. Clothing had been neatly laid out for each child on their beds, and a collection of children's books sat on a small bookshelf, one still open to a fairy tale illustration. In a grim contrast to these scenes of childhood normalcy, investigators discovered medical evidence that documented the children's deaths. In Joseph Goebbels' desk, they found a medical kit containing empty ampules of morphine and several crushed cyanide capsules. Dental records later confirmed Soviet forensic reports that each child had been sedated with morphine before being given lethal doses of cyanide. The children, Helga, Holder, Hilda, Hedda, Haida, and Helmuth, ranging in age from 12 to 4, had died in their sleep, arranged in their beds in night clothes. Magda Goebbels' personal effects revealed the psychological state of a mother who had decided that her children should not outlive the Reich. In her handbag, investigators found a half-finished letter to her adult son from a previous marriage who was in Allied captivity, attempting to explain her decision to kill her children. The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in, and therefore I have brought the children with me. Next to this letter was a photograph of the children with Hitler at his mountain retreat, a happier time that she apparently contemplated in her final hours. Physical evidence in Joseph Goebbels' office included his final written statement, a political testament echoing Hitler's blame of international Jewry for Germany's defeat, alongside a more personal letter to his stepson justifying the family's suicide as the honorable end that a German should choose. His appointment book showed that on May 1st, just hours before his death, he had still been making entries for events in the coming week, a facade of normalcy maintained until almost the very end. Unlike Hitler, who had arranged for his body to be burned immediately, the Goebbels had made less thorough preparations. Soviet investigators found their bodies in the garden above the bunker, partially burned in a shallow crater from a previous artillery shell. Joseph Goebbels had died of a gunshot wound to the head after ensuring his wife and children were dead. Magda had taken cyanide. The incomplete cremation left significant evidence for forensic examination, including confirmation that Joseph Goebbels' signature club foot, a disability that had shaped his life and psychology, was clearly identifiable. Soviet exploration. Mao, the first to enter when soldiers of the Soviet Union's Third Shock Army fought their way to the Reich Chancellery on May 2, 1945. They had no special orders regarding Hitler's underground command center. Their initial exploration of the Führer bunker was characterized by caution, curiosity, and the systematic collection of intelligence materials, creating the first and most comprehensive documentation of the site before later alterations and deterioration occurred. The first Soviet troops to enter the bunker were led by Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Klimenko, who later provided detailed accounts of the initial exploration. According to Soviet military records, the entry was challenging. German defenders had blocked some passages with debris, and there was initial concern about booby traps. The advance team moved cautiously through the upper Vorbunker first, securing each room before proceeding deeper into the complex. The Soviets followed established intelligence collection protocols, photographing each room before any items were disturbed. These photographs, many of which remain classified in Russian archives until the 1990s, provide the most accurate visual record of the bunker's original state. Soviet combat photographers documented everything from the layout of furniture to the positions of personal items, creating a meticulous record that would later prove invaluable to historians. What struck many of the Soviet soldiers was the contrast between the apocalyptic destruction of Berlin above ground and the relatively intact condition of the bunker. Lieutenant Anna Mongolina, a Soviet intelligence officer who specialized in document collection, later wrote, "It was like entering a parallel world. Above us, buildings were reduced to rubble, corpses lay in the streets. Below, we found rooms where it seemed the occupants might return at any moment. Cups still containing cold coffee, chairs pulled back as if someone had just risen from them." The Soviets discovered that despite orders to destroy sensitive materials, the hasty evacuation had left significant intelligence intact. Communication logs, military reports, and personal papers were quickly collected and secured for transport to Moscow. SMERSH, Soviet counterintelligence officers, were particularly interested in Hitler's personal papers and any documents that might confirm his death, as Stalin remained skeptical that Hitler had actually committed suicide. The Soviet soldiers' personal accounts reveal the psychological impact of entering Hitler's last redoubt. Many described a sense of grim satisfaction at standing in the room where Hitler had killed himself, seeing it as symbolic closure to the devastating war he had unleashed on their homeland. Sergeant Vasily Churikov of the 3rd Shock Army recalled, "We had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, watched our comrades die and our villages burn. Now we stood in the very room where the architect of that suffering had ended his life. Several men simply sat down and wept, not from sadness, but from a sense that a terrible circle had closed." The Soviets removed numerous items as both military intelligence and as war trophies. Records show official seizure of all communications equipment, weapons, military documents, and Hitler's personal effects. These were catalogued and transported to Moscow for analysis. Additionally, individual soldiers took unofficial souvenirs, everything from silverware emblazoned with Hitler's initials to personal items from the bedrooms. Many of these unofficial trophies would later emerge in private collections and museums across Russia. Perhaps most significantly, Soviet forensic teams collected biological evidence, including blood samples from the sofa where Hitler died, fragments of skull and teeth found in the garden where his body was burned, and medical supplies from his personal quarters. These materials would prove crucial in later identification efforts, though some samples were kept in classified Soviet archives for decades, fueling conspiracy theories about Hitler's fate. Preservation challenges the bunker's fate. The Führer bunker complex, where the Third Reich met its end, presented immediate and complex preservation challenges to post-war authorities. The site represented both crucial historical evidence and a potentially dangerous shrine for Nazi sympathizers. The competing imperatives of historical documentation, denazification, and practical urban reconstruction would shape the bunker's complex afterlife. Immediately after the war, the bunker complex fell within the Soviet occupation zone of Berlin. Soviet authorities initially secured the site for intelligence gathering, but by late 1945, practical concerns emerged about its future. East German communist officials expressed concern that the bunker might become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazi groups. These fears, combined with Soviet leader Stalin's strategic ambiguity about Hitler's death, led to the first attempts to destroy the complex in December 1947. Soviet engineers placed explosives in key structural points, but the reinforced concrete, designed to withstand Allied bombing, proved surprisingly resistant even to deliberate demolition attempts. This failed destruction created a peculiar situation that would persist for decades. The bunker complex remained largely intact but officially destroyed in Soviet records. The ground above was leveled and deliberately left unmarked on East German maps of Berlin. When the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961, the site fell within the heavily guarded death strip between East and West Berlin, effectively removing it from public access and historical examination for the next 3 decades. During this period, the historical documentation of the bunker faced significant challenges. The most comprehensive records remained classified in Soviet military archives, while Western historians had to rely on testimony from former bunker occupants who had survived and fled westward. This documentation gap created fertile ground for historical inaccuracies and conspiracy theories about Hitler's final days. The first serious historical assessment of the bunker's condition came only in 1987, when East German authorities, preparing for Berlin's 750th anniversary celebrations, allowed a limited archaeological survey. The team discovered that despite officially being destroyed, approximately 70% of the bunker structure remained intact beneath the surface, though partially flooded and deteriorating from 4 decades of neglect. After German reunification in 1990, the site presented new dilemmas. The newly democratic German government faced competing pressures. Historical preservation groups advocated for documenting and selectively preserving the bunker for educational purposes, while others worried about creating a macabre tourist attraction that might glorify Hitler. Practical urban planning concerns also arose as the area, no longer part of the Berlin Wall's death strip, was prime real estate in the newly reunified capital. The German government ultimately adopted a policy often described as intentional mundanity. In 1988-89, during construction of a residential complex along what was once Hermann Göring Strasse, Portions of the bunker were indeed destroyed. The most historically significant sections, including Hitler's personal quarters and the conference room, were filled with concrete during construction projects in the 1990s. The East German government made a deliberate decision to build ordinary apartment buildings and a parking lot over the site, ensuring that no physical structure would remain as a potential shrine. Historians and archaeologists documented their concerns about this approach. Dr. Heinz Müller-Blattau of the Berlin Archaeological Society noted, "We are deliberately burying historical evidence under concrete and cars. While understandable from a political perspective, it represents a loss to historical knowledge that future generations may regret." Others argued that Germany's confrontation with its Nazi past was better served by the absence of physical relics that might become pilgrimage sites. Today, the site's historical significance is acknowledged only by a small information board erected in 2006 near the southeast corner of Gertrud Kolmar Strasse and in Den Ministergarten, describing the bunker's basic history and layout. Ordinary apartment buildings stand above where Hitler spent his final days, with residents going about their daily lives in a purposefully normalized space.